Well, that offering is taken. I'm going to just jump right into our message this morning. This summer, what I'm doing for the 12 weeks of summer is we're looking at, I've called this series The Greatest Stories Ever Told. And I say that because the Bible is filled with rich, rich stories. And I really think I believe they are the greatest stories ever told. Some of these stories we knew when we were little kids. If you grew up in a church, maybe some of your Bible schools and Sunday schools or even catechism classes or maybe where you went to school or at home, you were taught some of these fundamental Bible stories. And what I love about these stories of thousands of years ago in the Old Testament is we still find ourselves in these stories today. When we go back and we look at these stories, we can draw the line, we can trace our history for who we are today and go back, and not only can we see where we came from, but we see God's plan unfolding. And I always think if we would have grown up in the Old Testament, we would not have been able to see what we see today. We have the blessing of living on the other side and being able to look back and see how God's plan unfolds. And I love that because for me, it just helps me. It helps me believe more and more and trust more and more in God's plan, even when it doesn't make sense. This morning in my personal devotions, this has nothing to do with the sermon, but this morning in my personal devotions, I'm looking at the story of Joseph and Potiphar, right? If there ever was a story as it unfolded that didn't look like it was going to make sense, it's a story like that. And no matter where Joseph was, he sought to bless the Lord, and the Lord blessed him. And when you get to look at the whole plan, it's like it all worked out. God has a purpose in all of it. That's what I love when I go back and I look at the Old Testament and I look at these stories that sometimes don't make sense. And then we get the blessing of seeing today, it all makes sense. So I guess if there's a side message in all of this morning, it's this. When something in your life doesn't make sense, just give it to God. Give it to God and just trust that somehow He's going to work some good through it. This morning, I want to look at Sodom and Gomorrah. Really kind of a bad story, if you will. But when we look back at the last several weeks, we started with creation, sin, and how God came down, right? God intervened. And then we had the flood. God again intervened to deal with sin. Then last week, some 400 years later, right? Population is wiped out with the flood. Noah and his family repopulate the earth, and we get to the Tower of Babel. And man decides that he's going to take things upon himself, and he's going to build this great tower. And God says, look, if these people can do this, they can do anything. They don't need me. They'll abandon me. They're capable of doing anything. I've got to come down, and I've got to intervene and stop this. So God comes down, right? And he begins to make them speak in all different languages, right? God stepped in. When there was sin, God stepped in. In the garden, God stepped in. When there was the flood, God stepped in. Babel, God stepped in. This morning, you're going to see Sodom and Gomorrah. God steps in. God comes down and steps in. Now, if you've missed any of those, just a little plug here, you can pick them up through our website. The audio version is on our website. All the messages are there. Or you can watch them on YouTube, okay, at your convenience. But this morning, before I get into Sodom and Gomorrah, if we just pick up at Sodom and Gomorrah, we miss part of the story. So I'm going to do a little jumping around this morning, okay? You're used to that with me. We're going to do some connecting the dots, so just work with me. So before we look at that, I want us to back up to Genesis 18, if you will. We're going to look at Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, but we're going to back up to 18 because you need the context of 18 to understand what happens in the beginning of 19. So back in 18, the Lord appears to Abraham while Abraham is sitting outside of his tent where he lived. And 3 men appear to Abraham while Abraham's sitting outside of his tent. And they bring Abraham a message. Abraham is old, probably in his 90s. His wife, the same. And the 3 men, the visitors, bring Abraham a message, and they tell Abraham that his wife is going to have a baby. Now, I don't know how many of you are close to 90, but I think if 3 men showed up and I was 90 and said my wife is going to have a baby, what would you think? Huh? It's impossible. We're well beyond those years, right? And Abraham tells Sarah, and Sarah laughs. You laugh too. She thinks, what was Abraham smoking outside of his tent? But then God steps in and says, Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Why did Sarah laugh? And then he says, for with God, all things, as Mick's looking at me, all things, capital A-L-L, underlined, circle, highlighted, all things are possible with God, right? You get the context. Abraham at the tent, the visitors, the message. Now, pick up the text. Starting in 18:6. When the men got up to leave, these are the visitors I'm talking about. When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on the earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. God keeps his promises. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down. You see that again? God's going to come down again. That I will go down and see what they have done. If it's as bad as the outcry that has reached me, if not, I will know. The men turned away and went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? He's looking at Sodom. And Abraham knows how wicked Sodom is. And Abraham is saying, are you going to wipe out all of Sodom if there's some righteous people there? So Abraham begins to plead with God. There's this discourse in verses 24 through 33. And he says, Lord, if you find 50 people in that whole city that are righteous, will you wipe out the whole city? The Lord says, I'm going to wipe it out. He said, how about if there's 45? Let's negotiate. How about if there's 40? How about if there's 30? How about if there's 20? How about if there's 10? And the Lord says, if there's 10, I won't destroy it. He's begging with God not to destroy it. Now remember, backtracking here, like I said, connect the dots. If you back up to chapter 13, that was 18 and 19. If you back up to 13, Abraham and Lot are together, right? They've left promise. They're farming together. They've got their herds together, their sheep and their goats and their cattle, right? And they're farming together, but things got to be too large and the land wasn't going to support them for all the animals and everything they had. So they had to split ways, didn't they? It was actually their herdsmen that got into a battle between each other, or a conflict anyway, and that's when they decided to separate. So Lot takes off on his own with all his own herds and his herdsmen and his cattle and sheep and everything. And Abraham says to him, look, you decide where you're going to go. We need to split, right? But you decide where you're going to go. So Lot heads off towards Sodom, of all places. Now, look at Sodom, chapter 19, 1 through 4. The two angels, remember how many people there were that showed up with Abraham? 3. Maybe there's 2 angels and God. 2 men and God. Huh? 2, at this point, arrived at Sodom in the evening. And Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. Where was Lot before? He was in his tent. Outside of the city. Lot moved, didn't he? 2 angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed with his face toward the ground. My lords, he said, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then go your way early in the morning. No, they answered, we'll spend the night in the square. But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot. Now, I want to be sensitive to the nature of this morning, and especially with some of our youngest of kids in there here this morning. So I'm going to abbreviate those verses, okay? But all of the men, young and old, surrounded Lot's house, and they were demanding to have the men come out so they could have an intimate relationship with him. You get the picture? That's Sodom. That's how wicked Sodom was, that all the men, young and old, wanted the men to come out and have a relationship with them. Lot knows this is grossly wrong. He says, don't do such a wicked thing. But then he offers them his 2 daughters, his 2 young virgin daughters. You see the struggle? Do you see the conflicted nature of what's happening in Sodom? You see what happened when Lot moved already? Him and Abraham were together in a good land, and Lot moved over towards Sodom. Sodom was so full of wickedness that this is what the men wanted to do. And Lot's thinking, oh, this is terrible. Maybe it's just a better thing if you take my daughters. Was that a good offer? Do you see the environment and the decision? How conflicted? He wanted to do right, but yet he was caught up in a world full of sin, wasn't he? Now, we don't know why Lot offered the daughters. Maybe he thought that was a better choice. Maybe he thought their fiancés would come and rescue them. Maybe he thought it was a better option than with the men. What I want you to see is how grossly wrong, how grossly immoral Sodom was. You get a picture of just how awry things were and how enmeshed and hardened even Lot was to the situation, right? Pick up in verse 12 then, if you will, 19 verse 12. Listen to the story. The 2 men, angels, said to Lot, do you have anyone else here, sons-in-laws or daughters or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, they said, because we're going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-laws who were pledged to be married to his daughters. He said, hurry and get out of this place because the Lord is about to destroy the city. But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged, Lot, hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you'll be swept away when the city is punished. When he hesitated, get that, he hesitated. With doom on the way, he hesitates. It says the men grasped his hand and the hand of his wife and his 2 daughters and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you'll be swept away. But Lot said to them, no, my lords, please. Your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown great kindness to me in sparing my life. But I can't flee to the mountains. This disaster will overtake me and I'll die. Look, here is a town near enough to run to, and it is small. Let me flee to it. It is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared. He said to them, very well. I will grant this request too. I will not overthrow the town you speak of, but flee there quickly because I cannot do anything until you reach it. That's why the town was called Zoar. By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation of the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. There's a lot here, no pun intended. I looked at this past week, and I thought we could look at this for several weeks, and you could pull so much out of this. But let me just give you 3 things this morning that I think really speak to every one of this. And the first is, be careful where you pitch your tent. Be careful where you pitch your tent. Back up to Genesis 13 a minute. It says, Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men, as I talked about, parted company. Abraham lived in Canaan. Lot moved among the cities and the plain, and he pitched his tents near Sodom. And then it says, now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. When the two of them decided they had to part ways, Abraham stayed in Canaan, and Lot saw Sodom. Even though he knew Sodom was full of wickedness, he saw the land, and he saw the water, and he saw the possibilities of a good life. And I think he just figured, if I can just live there and not end up in the city, this is going to work out great. So he pitches his tent, and he moves his possessions and his animals and his herdsmen and his family, and that's where they camp out, aren't they? Just outside of the wickedness. Be careful where you pitch your tent. If you look at the next text, or the next chapter rather, in 18, when we open up the beginning verses, Lot no longer lived in the tent. Lot lived in the city. Can I just say that Lot got sucked into the city? The city looked pretty good to Lot. Lot had a lot going for Lot. You know, when the text talks about Lot being at the city gates, there's something significant to that. If you were a person that lived at the city gate, you probably were a pretty, maybe a prestigious person or a person with a lot of authority. You had some type of ruling. You dealt with the city leaders. You were in on the decisions of the city and the people. You were the people who worked with justice and worked with the governments. He was at the city gate. This was not just, he no longer was just living outside his tent. And he not only became a citizen of Sodom, but he became one of the leading figures in Sodom. You see that? You see how he moved from the tent to becoming a citizen in Sin City. Be careful where you pitch your tent. Lot had a lot of popularity. Lot didn't want to leave Sodom, did he? He hesitated. When he was told to get out, he hesitated. I think Lot sort of loved his position and loved life, but he was conflicted between Sodom and his faith. Men, girls, no, yes. You see the conflict? What happened when he moved into it? He became so much a part of it that what was maybe bad when he lived on the outside maybe didn't look as bad when you lived on the inside, because when you're so close to it and you're so living into sin, you don't realize it's sin anymore. Does that make sense? You just become so accustomed to what's happening that you just become hardened and calloused and insensitive to it. It just becomes a way of life. And Lot really became part of the life, but yet he wanted to be a godly person, didn't he? He was in that struggle. Isn't that us today? The good that I want to do, I don't do, and what I should do, right? We live in a world that says everything's permissible, and oh, it looks so good, and the enemy makes it look so good, and then we jump into it, and oh, it's so bad. That was Lot. Be careful where you pitch your tent. Number 2 is God doesn't tolerate sin. I said earlier, I always try to keep things real and simple. It doesn't get any more real or simple than that. God does not tolerate sin. He didn't tolerate sin in the garden. He came down. God didn't tolerate sin in the world. He brought the flood. He came down. God didn't tolerate the sin at Babel. He came down. God wasn't going to tolerate the sin of this truly wicked, perverse, immoral, obscene city. He came down and rained sulfur and fire on it. God does not tolerate sin. Now, God does not take pleasure in destroying people and destroying cities or destroying the wicked. However, we have a God who demands justice, and part of the justice is punishment of sin, isn't it? At the same time, do you see God's grace and mercy? I want you to see God's grace and mercy this morning, because you know what? God could have wiped out Lot. He could have said, Lot, I know you tried, but you failed, and you got sucked into all of this sin, you got caught up in it, and I'm going to snuff you out too. And even when Lot hesitated, God still found a way to pull him out and save Lot, didn't he, and his family? Was Lot the only righteous person and his family in that whole city? It's the only one he spared, right? But do you see God's grace? Do you see God's mercy for the people who have tried? Even though he lived in this unbelievably wicked city, Lot was trying to be righteous, and God rescued him from that and spared him and saved him. That's God's grace, isn't it? That gives me hope today in the world that I live in. But I think, what if Lot wouldn't have moved? And I'm not talking about moving from the tent into the city, but what if Lot would have said, you know what, angels, I'm staying here. I know you're calling me to this clean life, but I'm going to live the good life. And I'm still going to try to be righteous. What if Lot wouldn't have gone? What if Lot would have said, I'm staying here? You see how God gives second chances? God is a God of grace. What if he wouldn't have heeded the warnings? Maybe that's a question we need to ask ourselves this morning is, what sins are we living in? What sins do we live in? Some known, some unknown. And then what are the warnings? You know, when I was talking to the kids, I talked about sin and how we know we're sinning, right? Sometimes we know and sometimes we don't know. Sins of intentionality or unintentionality, commission, omission, whatever you want to call them, right? What are the sins that we ourselves know we're guilty of and God is warning us or telling us to stop, and we keep living in those sins? I think, what if we don't move from them? And that's a question we've got to ask ourselves. God blesses obedience. God punishes disobedience. Be careful where you pitch your tents. God doesn't tolerate sin. And then 3 is, leave sin and don't look back. If you're in Sodom and God is telling you to get out, then get out. Get out. Leave your sin and don't look back. You see, what happened with Lot is when Lot left Sodom, I think there was a lot of Lot that was left back in Sodom. There was a part of Lot that stayed there, wasn't there? But Lot just marched his way out of Sodom, didn't he? What did his wife do? She turned around, and if you were to look at that in a Hebrew text, the verb there it means to gaze intently, to stare into it, to look back and say, oh. And the text said they were told to get out and not look back. And what did she do? It says, but Lot's wife looked back, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. I think there's a lesson for us there. To get out and don't look back at what you've given up, but look at what you're gaining. Pull this together this morning. The truth is, we live in a sin-saturated society, don't we? We live in a pretty corrupt world. But we have an awesome God. We live in a world that you just stand in the checkout lane at a grocery store, right? And just look at all the stuff, right? And I want to be careful with this, but I just look at what TV and what movies and everything says is okay. And to me, I just see, if I'm wrong, this is how I feel. There's just a lot of Sodom in the U.S. today. There's just a lot of Sodom. And you know what, as Christians, Josh talked about it a couple of weeks ago. He said, we just kind of see it and we don't even do anything about it anymore. We just become so sensitive or so insensitive to it or so callous to it or used to it that sometimes I think, are we living in tents outside, or are we living in Sodom? And I think there's a part of it that says we're living in Sodom, and somehow God is saying, look, I've called you to be separate. I've called you to be separate people. I've not called you to be happy. I've called you to be holy. And what does it mean to be separate? That means in our speech and in our conduct, we've got to look different than the rest of the world, doesn't it? We've got to look different, not just on Sunday, but we've got to look different all week long. If the world is going to see Christ, we can't blend in. I remember one of my high school teachers. I didn't think much of him at the time. I didn't think much of any of my teachers at the time. Oh. That's because I spent most of my time in the hall. But one of my teachers in high school always said, Mr. Ledeboer, he said, we are in the world but not of the world. I'll never forget that. I repeated that back to him when I sat at his deathbed when he was dying of cancer. And I thanked him for those words, probably 10 years ago. We're in the world, but not of the world. See, if we're of the world, God calls us to be separate, doesn't he? Everything about us has to look different. If the world is going to see Christ, they've got to see it through us. You know, the reality when I look at this text is, a couple things I'll point out here is, we can't grow spiritually when we're looking back, holding on, can we? If we're looking at Sodom and loving part of Sodom, even if it's a little part of Sodom, we can't grow spiritually if we're holding on to something that's holding us back. We've got to let that go. We've got to put that behind us so that we can let Christ grow us. Because just like Lot, we too are going to be judged one day for our way of life. I want to share this text from the New Testament with you. 1 John 2, 15 through 17. And right above it in the New Living Translation, there's a caption. It says, "Do not love this world." Now, I want to be... God gave us a world to love, but don't fall in love with this world because it's temporal. It says, "Don't love the world nor the things it offers you. For when you love the world, you do not have the love of the Father in you. For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure and a craving for everything else we see and pride in our achievements and possessions. These aren't from the Father, but are from the world. And this world is fading away, along with everything that people crave. But anyone who does what pleases God will live forever." It's not about this world, is it? Let me recap this. Be careful where you pitch your tent. All you campers, don't become part of the sin around you. Listen to the warning signs. Run and don't look back. That's God's command. Because when we do, we'll not only experience God's mercy and His grace, but when it comes to Judgment Day, may God find us faithful so we can live with Him forever. Not in this world, but in a world that far outshines anything. Our best day here is going to be nothing like our days in heaven. Amen? That's His promise. Let's live.